notes.
Dobar dan svima. Dobrodošli na ovaj plenarni panel. Welcome to this panel on the Is it time for a new commission on the Balkans? We have a very big panel, as you see, and we'll try and be as efficient as we can. I'd like to introduce the panel before I give the floor to Hedvig Morvai, whose European Fund for the Balkans is a partner in organizing this panel. And I'm particularly pleased and honored that we have very distinguished speakers, but if I dare say most distinguished of all is Mr. Giuliano Amato, the former Prime Minister of Italy and judge of the Constitutional Court, and obviously co-chair of the International Commission on the Balkans that produced its report in 2005. Secondly, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Goran Svilanović, now the chair of the Regional Cooperation Council in Sarajevo. Dr. István Gyarmati, who runs the Center for Democratic Transition in Budapest. My colleague and friend with whom I studied a long time ago in Paris, Professor Jacques Rupnik. Dr. Dejan Jović, who is an advisor to the Croatian president. And last but not least, Dr. Vedran Džihić, who is a professor and senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. I will say a few words about the subject, but I will first give the floor to Ms. Hedvig Morvai to introduce this panel. Hedvig.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers for accepting the idea to design the panel, the last panel of this forum, in this way, because I strongly believe, and we at the European Fund for the Balkans strongly believe, that this will give us the opportunity to speak about an issue which should be raised in the Balkans today, and the Belgrade Security Forum is the right place to send this message to the wider public in the region and abroad. At this point, the Western Balkans has experienced more than a decade without armed conflict. The violence of the previous decade has taken its toll, however, not only in terms of deaths and displacement, but also by delaying the region's ability to catch up with the democratization process, which began a decade earlier in the rest of post-communist Central and Eastern Europe, whilst controversies over the past continued to haunt political debates. As a result, out of the countries termed the Western Balkans, only Croatia managed to join in 2013, and this is some 13 years after the launch of the stabilization and association process. The rest of the region of the so-called Western Balkans remains still distant from accession for the foreseeable future, and some countries remain blocked altogether. In addition to the challenges of political and economic transformation, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro and Serbia remain weak states with dysfunctional institutions, notwithstanding the considerable diversity among them. These are some of the findings of a report which was published by an initiative called the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. But let's go back a bit in the past and see how the developments which actually gave the reason for organizing this panel went through the past years. At the Thessaloniki summit in 2003, the European Council declared that the future of the Balkans is within the European Union. This was the promise which is shaping the developments in the Western Balkans region today. 2 years later, in 2005, the International Commission on the Balkans was established under the initiative of the Robert Bosch Stiftung, the King Baudouin Foundation, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. It was chaired by Mr. Giuliano Amato, and it published a report in 2005 titled The Balkans in Europe's Future. The Commission observed that the Western Balkans had become a relatively stable region with no military conflicts, no ongoing ethnic cleansing, and free, if not always fair, elections. The aim of the International Commission on the Balkans was to present results which could stimulate debate on the future of the region and ultimately help develop a vision for the integration of the countries of the Southeastern Europe into the European Union. Then already, a year after publishing the report, you published a declaration in Rome where you say, "We can only regret this unfortunate development," referring to the Salzburg meeting, where the Commission concluded that the EU must show that it has the power to transform weak states and divided societies. This is imperative for the Balkans, but no less so for the EU. Unless the EU adopts a bold accession strategy which integrates all Balkan countries into the Union within the next decade, it will remain mired as a reluctant colonial power at enormous costs in places like Kosovo, Bosnia, and even Macedonia. The Rome Declaration was again a new message only a year after the publishing of the report of the International Commission on the Balkans to the EU, not to lose the Balkans by not giving clear perspectives and not sticking to a real, transparent and motivating process for integrating these countries as soon as possible into the EU. The European Fund for the Balkans was established in 2007 as a direct follow-up to the work of the International Commission on the Balkans, with the aim to support member state building strategy in the countries of the Western Balkans, which includes the development of functioning state administrations and constituency building as its main priorities. Well, 9 years after the publication of the report of the International Commission on the Balkans, the Western Balkan countries remain as close to failure as they are to success when it comes to the process of European integration. The region's profile remains a mixture of unconsolidated democracies, weak states, and international protectorates, jeopardized by low economic growth and high levels of unemployment and corruption. Bearing this in mind, the European Fund for the Balkans has established the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group with a new mandate and fresh approach so as to make one more attempt at assisting the transition of the Balkans from unconsolidated democracies and weak economies to the stage of EU accession. The Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group seeks to constitute itself as a central node around which policy debates related to the EU enlargement towards the Western Balkans and democratic and economic reforms are focused. As such, it is the goal of the initiative to promote a constructive, innovative policy dialogue that is region-wide and affects decision-makers both in the region and in the EU. Shortly, I would just reflect to one more person which is thinking a lot about the Balkans and dealing with the Balkans and who is, I hope, still somewhere here among us, Ivan Krastev.
He's gone.
He's gone, okay. I miss him, unfortunately. Who, in his introductory remarks to the last published Balkan Monitor report in 2010, says that the Balkans are more a part of Europe than any of the most ardent advocates of EU enlargement can begin to imagine. All the problems that the region faces are European issues and not predominantly Balkan ones. The questions that people in the region ask themselves are not related to the past, they are related to the future. However, focused on their own problems, Europeans do not have time to think about how the crisis in the Union impacts the countries on Europe's periphery. This should change. The Balkans' new normality is very much a reflection of Europe's new normality. And when we look at the Balkan countries, it is true that EU has lost its magic in the region, but has not lost its importance. It is clear that if the citizens of the region have any realistic hope of a better life and political stability, then that has to be related to the prospect of their country joining the EU. It was true for 2010, and I think it's still very much the reality today in 2014. Thank you.
Hedvig, thank you very much for those introductory words. Let me just add very briefly a few bullet points to add to what you have already said. Namely that, let me start with a very general point about what happened in the Balkans in the 90s. Something happened at the end of the 20th century in Europe that should not have happened. As the return to Europe was the name of the day after the fall of '89, when all the countries of the former communist bloc really were running towards Brussels and trying to see the back of the Soviet troops that had occupied their territories. The former Yugoslavia basically imploded into a self-inflicted conflict that was then peppered and salted by a variety of international interventions. I deeply believe that we did this to ourselves and brought upon us all the complications of international intervention. And yet, because we are core geographic Europe, it has never been a question whether these countries should and would become, as the Thessaloniki summit stated it in 2003. There is no official pronouncement that anything changes in that regard. There are many statements by individual politicians in every country that, enlargement is stopping, slowing down. For 5 years there won't be anything, and we'll come back to all that. But let me add that since the Commission on the Balkans, as you remember, 2 countries joined NATO also, Croatia and Albania. In 2008, 3 countries became members of Partnership for Peace in 2006 at the Riga NATO summit, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia. After a long delay. We have a visa-free regime, which is probably the most tangible thing for citizens that you, Hedvig, and others have worked so tirelessly to achieve, and we can now travel without impediment, although there's always talk about will the visas be abolished because of the immigration. And of course, let me state my colors immediately. I am of the glass is half full, and that we are advancing, and that it will not be a failure, in spite of everything that we have seen. And frankly, I think it's good that the magic has been lost. I think that's very healthy, because we realistically approach this issue. And as the Prime Minister, for example, said here yesterday, we all know that this is about us and our homework. And then the EU membership will come as a result of our own efforts to make our societies a better place. So just a few pointers as we initiate this discussion. And I would like to ask Giuliano Amato to take the floor first and give us a brief retrospective view of what he believes was the achievement of the Commission then, and what, if anything, should be done to pursue this work in a different guise or not. But let me just say, before I give the floor to him, that there's obviously history that we all know about commissions, whether it's the Carnegie Commission around the time of the Second World War. We have Jacques Rupnik here, who produced the Commission report in the mid-90s called Unfinished Peace. There was a smaller commission financed by the Swedish government on Kosovo. And so this falls into a bigger and larger category, of which I would think the novelty of the International Commission of the Balkans, co-chaired, as we said, by Giuliano Amato and Richard von Weizsäcker, is that we had the participation of local experts and politicians. That was the real change with respect to the commission that Jacques Rupnik led. We had already been in 2004, and thus we deemed it necessary to have voices from the region, from these countries, participate. Giuliano Amato, please.
Well, thank you, Ivan. The difference between our commission and the previous ones was, first of all, what you have said, your last point. It was not a commission on the Balkans, it was a commission of the Balkans, with others also, of course, with some members who did not belong to the region, but we were working together. And we were perhaps luckier somehow than our predecessors. As Ivan was now mentioning, there were at least 2 other commissions to be mentioned. The first one, more than a century ago, hostilities in the Balkans, was its main topic. The idea at the time was to focus upon the atrocities of the Balkan War. It's to demonstrate that it should never happen again. But only a few months later, the other ones, the big powers, started off with the First World War. And therefore, the idea that the Balkans were doing something exceptional became bizarre quite easily. The second important commission, much closer to ours, was the commission that had Jacques Rupnik as, were you General Director, General Secretary General? In other words, he wrote the report. He conceived the report and he wrote it. Unfinished Peace, a wonderful title, and the belief that at the time, despite Dayton, this was the beginning of the peace, not the accomplishment of it. So they were right, because in the following years we had the Kosovo War, we had the conflict in Macedonia, and we arrived afterward. We arrived in a very unstable region, weak under many angles, but peace was there. And there were no more wars after our report. So this is quite a difference. We were confident that this could happen throughout our visits around, and substantially the focus of our attention was certainly on the region, on the states of the region, but no less on the European Union. Now it does not depend only on the region, it does also depend on the European Union. And in fact, I concluded my introduction to the report by saying, if the European Union chooses success over failure in the Balkans, the next 2 years could see the beginning of a long-term solution to the problems, etc., etc. And I also wrote, it would also mean, these were the final words of my introduction, it would also mean that this was the last international commission on the Balkans which had to be initiated. And now you are asking me whether a new commission might be needed. So it means that something has gone wrong. Something has gone wrong. But I must say that something also has happened, and it was already mentioned. These were not lost years. Countries that have, states that have entered the NATO, Croatia that has entered the European Union, others here that are candidate countries now formally. I have said it already, you know, perhaps the boldest, let's say, proposition in our report was the proposition on Kosovo. It was not easy for us to argue on behalf of the independence of Kosovo for several reasons, but it was clear to us that a joint government here, in a new unavoidable federal sort of combination between Kosovars and Serbs, was even less likely than the coexistence between a Kosovar state and Serbia. But it was not easy. it was difficult for Serbia to accept it. We were well aware of the meaning of Kosovo, of the holy seats, of the many historical links. I said to myself, it will take time. Well, in my view, and I expressed already my admiration to Serbia a few months ago, the fact that a texture of relations has been set and that there is something that is being built upon this texture, chapeau. This is quite an achievement, quite promising for the future. And a sort of, for us who wrote it, and I must say that it was courageous, and courageous he was more than anybody else at the time, for quite understandable reasons. This has happened. Other things have happened. We still have unsolved problems that require both the regional authorities and the European Union ones to reinvigorate the process. I know that the European Union and mostly the Eurozone are not so sexy as I'd like them to be. But what is sexy around us nowadays? Is it sexy here? All of us are facing new problems of economic growth in a world that has changed, both because of globalization and because of technological changes that are completely transforming also the labor market, the qualifications to find jobs, etc. If we face all of these new challenges together in the same European Union, all of us have many more chances to pass through. We have to be convinced of this, and we need advocacy for this case, the case of the Balkans, the case of all of the Europeans together in facing common challenges that Europe has to face. The latest from Brussels are not, it's better having a commissioner for enlargement negotiations than a commissioner for nothing in relation to enlargement. But never the Byzantine culture of Brussels had invented something so absurd as negotiating as an end in itself. You, my commissioner, have a mission. You have to negotiate. Don't get anywhere, because if you get somewhere, you go beyond the mandate. But please, stay there and negotiate. Okay, people, be patient. Be patient. It's better than nothing. It's better than nothing. But in order for it to produce something, there has to be an atmosphere around that somebody has to create. In this sense, a new commission on the Balkans can be useful, and perhaps already does exist with your policy advisory group. Don't name it Commission on the Balkans because it's not so lucky as a definition, I would say. It's the typical unaccomplished kind of thing. But it is extremely useful to do both, to somehow promote inside the European Union this case and to exercise a discrete role of mediation to solve the remaining disputes here. Certainly, there are disputes that don't depend on the Bosnia depends on itself. Macedonia does not depend on itself. Sooner or later, in the name of Alexander the Great, those two countries should find an agreement. He would have found it. Now, they can't quarrel with each other in the name of Alexander and being so poorly equipped to solve problems that he would have solved in a few minutes, and years are passing and that problem is still there. But my answer is that something more is needed, and I'm very grateful to you because perhaps you are doing it.
Thank you very much, Giuliano Amato. As some of you recall, and some of us were here, that we launched the report here in this room in 2005. It was somewhat a smaller format than this big one. And as Prime Minister Amato said, Goran Svilanović suffered. He was very courageous. He signed the report, and it's like the rooster that sings too early. The historic agreement between Belgrade and Pristina, signed in April between the prime ministers then, is truly following the lines of what the Commission said. I mean, we're simply following the rule book that the Commission espoused, and thus it seems normal today that we have this normalization of relations. Obviously, a lot to do on the implementation of the agreement, but there's clearly a determination to lead this to a harbor where things will be resolved. And in the previous panel on Ukraine, I will quote Franco Frattini, who is sitting here, who said that the Balkans are a success story of the European Union. So, Goran, I'll ask you to reflect on your role and what the Commission did, and maybe to agree or disagree with Mr. Franco Frattini.
Thank you for kind words, both to you as well as to dear friend Giuliano. I'd like to say the following. Yesterday's opening of this forum and the very kind words addressed to me by the Prime Minister are yet another proof why the politics is beautiful, and I love it, providing you live long enough. And therefore, I would really love to use a minute or two of the time I'm sharing with the distinguished colleagues here in the panel and all of you by focusing on what is in front of us rather than looking back. What I think is in front of us, and I'm now addressing the 6 economies that are in the accession and association process, the stabilization association process, is the following. The target is clear. It is 5 years plus 1 day. And I'm going to repeat this as of now in the coming months and years. 5 days and 1 day should be a target for every prime minister, every politician in these 6 economies. So we need to be ready. How will the EU look like in 5 years and 1 day? I don't know. But those sitting in Brussels, those who are going to be employed as of November 1st, they don't know either. So there we are equal. And we are jointly in the process of shaping the EU. It's part of our lives as it is part of their job and life as well. Therefore, what we need to do is to focus to be ready in 5 days and 1 day, meaning to successfully accomplish. In case of Montenegro and Serbia, it is feasible, and I believe that can be done. And then the first day when the new Commission starts, let's see what is the EU like and what is the policy of the EU. Second, what I like to say is that at that day, Serbia must not be the poorest among the 28 already in, if we intend to dream of accession. This is the must. By the way, while entering the EU, Croatia was not the poorest among the 27. Therefore, what has changed? It is the fact that the citizens of the EU who need to elect the politicians of the EU who would be the ones to support our bid to join the EU. The citizens need to be convinced we are like it. And at this point, they are not. So they need to see us as rich as they are or close. But that does not only go for economy. This is relevant also how they see us when it comes to culture, politics, freedom of media, respect of human rights. We need to be like them so that they feel that we are almost there. Only then they'll vote for those politicians who will support our bid to join the EU. So these are the two things, 5 years and 1 day, and we need to do our job, successfully negotiating complete negotiations. Second, it's very much about economy. It's not all about economy. Frankly, these days, when it comes to our country and the countries around, it's all about all. So the values are as relevant as economy. But I've spent a minute on economy. For I think that the crisis really had a devastating impact, including on the processes like enlargement. We have lost in these 6 economies 800,000 jobs in 5 years. These people are threat to stability, number one. And then all other issues. We need to understand the social devastation of the social fabric we're living in is the real threat, not whether the politicians will say this or that. Therefore, what I want to say is I'm very much in support to what you're doing, Hedvig, and supported by everybody else. Whether we're going to call it a commission or not doesn't really matter. What I believe is needed, we need to engage back to our governments and to really support them, advise them to do their job. For, in my eyes, look how do negotiations look like. Serbia shall hopefully open chapter 32 before the end of the year. Is it end of the year or January, February? Doesn't really matter. What does matter is the fact that it's all about fiscal stability. Who among the citizens of this country is against of fiscal stabilization? Irrespective of what she or he think of the EU. We are frightened from inflation. We are indebted. And every citizen will support the bid of the government to fiscally stabilize the country, to make sure that we are not going to end up in inflation, and that we are gradually limiting our debts. Everyone. Then what is going to be the next step? 23, 24. Organized crime and reform of judiciary. Every citizen of this country will support this. What I'm saying is that the lucky and a good thing is that the accession process is all about fulfilling dreams which every citizen of the country has, irrespective of his or her attitude towards the membership into a union. Therefore, the fact that we don't know what is going to be in 5 days and 1 day with the EU and with the accession process should not prevent the governments from engaging on delivering of what they've been voted for. And this is to make this and the countries around a better place for living. This is the value of the EU accession process. It is actually streamlining the processes which anyhow are delivering a better economies and a better societies. So this would be my idea. Let's focus on this, and these people and many others, I believe, are ready to engage not only with our politicians, but also with our colleagues in the capitals as well as in Brussels, to explain the relevance of the accession process and the full membership eventually. I'm very much optimistic that this will be a future of the EU. But all I've said now was just one idea. Even if it doesn't happen, what has to happen is that we improve in this region, in every of these economies, both economically and value-wise. And then I think that the whole story about the membership will be less relevant, more feasible, and we can do it. Yes, we can. Thanks.
Goran, thank you very much. And just to remind everyone, as you remember, the great benefit was a loss for the former country, which when Svilanović stepped down as foreign minister, but that was the reason that we could then engage him as a member of the Commission from Serbia. Of course, the big change from 2005, as Hedvig alluded to, was really the economic crisis, which has so much complicated this whole process because of the social and economic challenges of a population that is highly unemployed, and especially the youth, as was mentioned. I will call upon a great friend of the region and of this country, István Gyarmati, who has done many things, but among others, he was instrumental in bringing his country, Hungary, into NATO membership. So with everything that he is prepared to say, I would like to ask István to reflect on that dimension of the Euro-Atlantic integration. This region is fully encircled by NATO members who have joined since. So I'd like to ask him, what is the relationship thus between EU enlargement and NATO membership, again, along with the other things that he wants to tell us?
Thank you, Ivan. Good morning, everybody. Afternoon, actually. Maybe your introduction didn't make me very popular in this country about NATO. Doesn't really matter. I'm not running for office, so it's no need to be very popular. Let me start with one thing that, or two, that are, I think, very important. First of all, why is the time ripe for a new Balkan Commission, whatever we call it? Many people said, when I was talking to them in Brussels, in Berlin, in Budapest, that well, nobody cares about the Balkan. How can you start a commission? Nobody will pay attention. My answer has been that this is exactly why we should start it. Not only to raise awareness, but also to have some proposals ready by the time when people will start taking interest. Because when politicians will start taking interest and it will be on their agenda, they will start taking decisions, and then all what we can do is damage limitation, because they will usually take wrong decisions. So I think we need to influence them before they start thinking. Second reason why I think it's time now is Russia. Obviously, the European Union, or to a lesser extent NATO, and the United States are not able to deal with Russia. They have no idea. So they cannot spit it out and they cannot swallow it. We are choking on Russia. Sometimes we are introducing sanctions. Sometimes we are calling for a Chamberlain-type Munich conference, which is, of course, the worst of all worlds. Now in the Western Balkans, I think we have a chance to deal with Russia. To deal with Russia, to show Russia, since Russia basically doesn't have too much influence in the Western Balkans, except what we have left to Russia, even in Serbia, where people think that Russia is very influential. It's very influential because some Serbs want it, and because the European Union doesn't really care. So we can deal with Russia, knowing that the influence is very limited, and therefore it is possible to include Russia into our efforts. Because when Russia feels strong, like in Ukraine, it's no way we can cooperate. But when Russia knows somewhere that it's weak, we can include Russia, and maybe that can be start of a new process. So I think the time is now. What should we be focusing on? I think I agree with Goran, so I don't need to repeat what the region is supposed to do. But as I said the day before yesterday in the first panel, I think the real problem is the West, whatever the Western Europe and the United States. The West, which has no imagination, no courage, no appetite to take bold decisions. It's a muddling through exercise from Western Europe. And I don't say the new Commission to do much more than that. I hope I'm wrong. So therefore, if and when we set up a Commission, it has to do two jobs. The first one is to internalize and to deepen what Goran has said, aimed at the region. And secondly, to raise awareness in the West, especially in the European Union, in America, also in NATO. Because these countries can do whatever they can. They can perform extremely well. I'm afraid they will not. But even if they perform extremely well, it will not be taken, not be accepted, not taken as enough. There will be always new and new requirements, because if and as long the West is not ready to take these countries or anybody else in. So we need to raise awareness in the West. And in order to be able to do that, I think these countries should stop telling the West why they want to be members. Why is it good for this region and for the countries to be part of the West, to be part of the European Union? But you should start, or we should start explaining, why is it good for the West? Explain why, what would they gain by integrating these countries? And this general answer that it's a big market, etc., doesn't work. It's too vague. It's also not very true. So I think we have an opportunity and we have the need to do that. I think we also need, and I'm very grateful that István raised this question, we need to think about NATO. It's not a mission impossible. Serbia joined PFP quite late, but before Serbia joined NATO, the Serbian army was reformed by General Ponuš more than, I wanted to say more than the Hungarian army, but I don't want to say that, more than some NATO countries' armies. It's more NATO can compare, or it's a deteriorating situation, but it's been more NATO compatible than many NATO countries. So that's not the problem. The problem is how you use it, how you show it that you are ready not only to reform your own country, but also to make contributions. I think the fact, for instance, that Serbia did not send observers to the OSCE mission in Ukraine was an extremely bad message. Not only because it's the incoming chair of the OSCE, and the incoming chair is supposed to learn, to know what's going on, and you cannot do it without a presence on the ground, but it's a bad message. It shows something that I don't think is entirely true, that relations with Russia are more important than relations with the West, because you don't want to upset Russia by sending observers. You have extremely good people who could do that. Similar things must happen. But the most important thing is, and if you look at Montenegro, what was the problem with Montenegro's NATO accession? It was not the lack of an army. It was the assumption, probably also the truth, that Montenegro's secret services are informing the Russians too much. This is also the assumption about Serbia. You have to reform your police and your services. It's also in relation to the human rights and protection of human rights, but also foreign policy-wise. There is no way NATO will share information with a country that is not considered secure. And in some cases, if you ask the Americans and the Israelis, of course, they don't share information with anybody, so they say giving information to anybody other than to each other, even to each other, but other than to each other is as if you would post it in the Washington Post. But within NATO, and it's also true for police, you don't share information, therefore you do not cooperate really with a country where you are not absolutely sure that the information is at least in as safe hands as your own. So I think you don't need to invest too much in the army. A little would be good, but what you need to invest is security, information security, personal security, NATO compatibility. Don't talk about NATO accession at this point. It's not on the agenda. You would add to the problems because NATO doesn't want any enlargement at this point. But start behaving as if you were a contender for NATO membership. Send people to operations, not to UN. UN is important, but sending UN and not to NATO underlines that you are much more for non-NATO operations It actually deepens the impression that you are not NATO, not interested in working with NATO. And finally, I want to make a point about the OSCE chairmanship. 1994, when Hungary was the chair of the OSCE, what we did was in addition to running the chairmanship, is something that was very important for Hungary. In addition to the Tassar Air Base and the Okuchani battalion that we have deployed to participate in the Dayton implementation in Bosnia, the successful OSCE chairmanship, including our negotiations and our success to negotiate an agreement with the Russians about the OSCE mission in Chechnya, was, I think, the third crucial fact that we were the first to be invited to NATO, which was by far not sure. If 1 year from now, the impression of the world will be that you did a bad job in the OSCE chairmanship, that you were biased with the Russians, that you were afraid of the Russians, and watch my words when Putin comes in 2 weeks, because that's the beginning. Then the membership to NATO, and by that in the European Union, will become much more remote. On the other hand, if you do well, then I think it will help a lot. So when you will think about decisions and declarations, because words by politicians, high-level politicians, become material, you have to consider what's more important for you, to be friends with Russia or to get closer to the European Union. It's your choice, but then the consequences will be also yours. So I think in conclusion that time has come for a good commission of the Balkans or on the Balkans or whatever, because the situation is very different. In some places it has deteriorated, like in Macedonia and in Bosnia. In some places it has improved, like in Serbia. The engagement of the United States and Europe is different. Russia's role is different now. So many things have changed. And somebody has to come and tell the truth. Somebody has to tell the European Union, you must stop this idiocracy with Macedonia. Somebody should tell. And it's an easy way. All EU countries should recognize Macedonia by its constitutional name, and then it's done, basically. So it's a simple fix. Unfortunately, the situation in Macedonia has deteriorated much more, so it's not the only one, but that's the start. Bosnia, you have to, we heard Prime Minister Vučić, there is no appetite in Belgrade to swallow Republika Srpska. So why don't you ask them and us to make it clear, not only in words, but also in cooperation. It also includes a Russian factor. But also make it clear that the first step in Bosnia to make it work is not the Republika Srpska, it's the federation. You have to make the federation work, our own friends. And we have to tell our own friends, the Bosniaks and the Croats, they have to do the first step. Because if we have a dysfunctional federation, how can we expect the Serbs to join a dysfunctional federation? So I think there are some very unpleasant truths that have to be told, and I think that's why that's one of the reasons also why a new commission would be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacques. You were, as we said, instrumental in producing the report on unfinished peace in the mid-90s. So you can, with hindsight, look at the progress or lack thereof in this period, but I'd like to add another question to you, and it relates to what Prime Minister Amato said about the negotiations, which are a kind of endless process. And what I mean by that is that there's often comparison between the Turkish negotiations and the Western Balkans. And we know that the Turkish negotiations follow this endless path of negotiation. Nobody really sees whether this will ever end. Could you compare those two EU enlargements, and do you see a clear difference between the Western Balkan enlargement and the Turkish in terms of substance and geopolitics?
Okay, well, I'll get to that one. Well, first thing first, I want to thank the organizers, and particularly one organizer. You know, Goethe is supposed to have said on his deathbed, "Mehr Licht," more light. I would say, "Mehr Sonnenlicht." She really has been, over the years, I've been coming in and out of Belgrade for last 25 years, and Sonia has been in all the interesting things that were undertaken here. So special tribute for organizing this. And as a good disciplined academic, I was given by the organizers 4 questions. I have 4 minutes. I will devote 4 minutes to not to each of those, but to those questions, and get finally to your point, Ivan. Do we need a new commission? The experience that I had as commission is that the main question is not, is your policy advice or are your recommendations, still valid as it's put in the question? They may well be. The question is, who listens? Is anybody listening? So this is the first question you want to ask. Who you are addressing, what for, what is the goal? Because this is, otherwise, because, the Balkan Commission that I was part of, when we concluded, this was at the end of the war in Bosnia, we concluded, beware, next stop, Kosovo. And we did the rounds. We went to the White House, to Brussels, to visit all the capitals, etc. Everybody politely listened. They put the report in a drawer, a kind of gulag drawer, and that was it. Of course, then the crisis erupts in Kosovo. Yes, do we need another commission? Do we need no? So the first question is, what do you want the commission for? And if you are going to do it, make sure you come out with one big, one important message that you want to politically deliver. Because otherwise, the past commissions on the Balkans were conflict prevention kind of commission. How to understand conflict, what are the sources of conflict, what do we do about it? The 1913 commission, chaired by le Baron d'Estournel de Constant, fantastic report, which was republished by the Carnegie Endowment. It's a great report. It was released at the end of 1913. Of course, 1914, people were busy with other things besides reading reports, unfortunately. So, and the great thing about the commission that Prime Minister Amato chaired was that it no longer was focusing on conflict and the sources of conflict, but about the next subject, European integration, so the shift of focus. And that is really where we want to get. And if we can help that, then it makes sense. Otherwise, it's an academic exercise in conflict prevention studies, and some of us have to teach it, but I wouldn't create a commission especially for that. But if you have one big idea, and if you want one special target of people you want to reach, okay, that's maybe it. The second question is, how can attention be drawn in the EU to the Balkans after Croatia's accession? In the old days, my answer was, the loudest, the strongest message, and have a region. I've repeated this endlessly. Regional approach. That's the way to do it. Don't do this technocratic country by country with the acquis communautaire. It's too slow, and people get lost. And that was the old days. Given the current state of the EU, given the current state of our public opinion in the EU countries. I remind those who haven't read Eurobarometer that when you ask about enlargement, about 3/4 of Germans and Austrians are against, about over 2/3 of French, Belgium, Dutch as well, and even 51% of Czechs. So just be aware of that. You don't have the public opinion with you. And you have a political agenda that is crowded with other things. So in a way, the great thing about Croatia, the Croatian model has two things. One is, how do you turn rather nasty nationalists of the 1990s into Euro-compatible moderate nationalists who prepare for joining the EU? great. Well, that's Croatian model, and it actually works in this country. So, in a way, that's one Croatian model. The other Croatian model is enter in the EU as discreetly as possible. Last year, Croatia joined, I was going to say almost nobody noticed, in the EU and in public opinion. And in a way, I wouldn't want to overstate the case, but that discreet, the process is going on, we're not making fuss, we know that public opinion is concerned with the economic crisis, with unemployment, and with external threats, etc. The Balkans are there, they are moving on, etc. So that's would be the case for low-key approach, no need of kicking or screaming, but make sure that the process is moving on. And that's, of course, a big challenge. And therefore, if there is a commission, it would have to really address the political elites, the decision makers. I would have to think hard about how to do that. What is the best way to connect the Balkans with the EU today is the third question. I would say no longer by focusing on the security problems of the past, if you don't do this, we will go back to war or something. No, not Balkans as a security problem or not primarily. The idea is how you connect this region to the overall European agenda, to the overall European debate, to the way the European project is being redefined today. And that is really the interesting way. If you look 20 years ago, the two things were completely separate. 20 years ago, you had, Europe marching onwards and upwards to the supranational, borderless world of post-Maastricht, etc., post-national, supranational, what have you. And the Balkans were drifting into fragmentation, nationalism, 19th century ideologies, etc. Today, if you look at what is happening in the EU, well, Scottish referendum, next Catalonian referendum, Belgium is divided, regionalism of all kinds. You have the question of multiculturalism. In those days, how can you have, ethnicity so important? Well, look at the debate about multiculturalism in most European countries today. When I hear Chancellor Merkel at a party congress saying that multiculturalism is an utter failure in Germany, and I heard the French president and Cameron saying similar things in their own countries. Well, the debate about how different communities coexist in Europe, in the Balkans, etc. These are the same debates we are sharing. And I'm not saying we're witnessing a Balkanization of Europe, though one could perhaps see it that way as well. But we have a certainly much more connected debate than we had 20 years ago. You want to make Balkans relevant, draw attention to EU, I would say make Balkans part of those European debates that matter. And in fact, the debates that matter most is about the future architecture of the European project. And that is being redefined through what? Through the Euro crisis and basically it coming out of the Euro crisis through deepening of integration. That is one option, sort of the inner core of the EU. And you have the explosion of our peripheries. So this is what redefines today. This is the dual crisis that Europe is trying to cope with. And the Balkans, of course, instead of just like yesterday saying, there is, somebody said center and periphery. No, we must not talk center and periphery. And we, we are also, periphery is a bad word. Okay, maybe it's a bad word, find a better one. But that's not the point. You always have centers and peripheries. The new thing is that the centers are no longer what they used to be. They are being redefined. And the peripheries are changing, and sometimes changing in a very explosive manner, as we can see in the Ukraine or in the south. So the Balkans used to be in the category of bad neighborhoods, okay? Dealing with bad neighborhoods. Now we have other bad neighborhoods. And what if the Balkans had something to tell us about how to cope with those issues? And therefore, I would say, yeah, the idea that Balkans force us or can be an incentive to rethink enlargement, the most successful policy of the EU of the last 20 years, undoubtedly, though nobody is allowed to say so because public opinion apparently, we are told, that doesn't like it. So it's a chicken and egg problem. And of course, in coping, in reinventing the neighborhood policy, which was derived from the enlargement policy and which is in tatters, you know. We will open our markets and you will adopt our values. Well, you know, if you believe that, you'll believe anything. Okay, so yeah, include the Balkans in those debates. Finally, do we need a new commission? I don't know. What we have is we have a new European Commission, and that is our problem. And we have a new European Commission without a commissioner. So, you know, one of my favorite authors, Arthur Koestler, wrote a book, The Yogi and the Commissar. That some of you might know. The yogis is a symbol of systems that want to change humankind through inner change. The commissar stands for systems that we knew in the 20th century that want to change humankind through external, you know. In the Balkans, we need both. The process has to be, there have to be inner change in the region, and that everything that has been said, starting with the economy, as Goran Svilanović said, and then we have to work, and the Commission can work on that, on the making sure that the external change, not the kind of commissar that Koestler had in mind, we might have a more human version of that, but that makes sure that that external drive, that external motivation remains strong there.
Thank you, Jacques. Dejan Jović, we're closing in on time here, so I'd like to move on as quickly as possible, but I cannot resist the temptation to open the issue to regional cooperation. That's something definitely that has improved since 2005 in these 9 years. And I see our friend Tim Judah, of course, here, who notably spoke about the Yugosphere that set up a lot of dust in the region, but of course, I think we all know what he meant, that there is good ground after the conflict to reconstitute links and networks that existed in culture, sports, economy, business, you name it. The regional life is very intense, not only because Svilanović is in Sarajevo leading the Regional Cooperation Council, but there are constant flows of people. We just had a wonderful cultural event, Pristina and Belgrade, Serbian-Albanian cooperation, and you know we have Sarajevo days here and vice versa all over the region. So then apart from the other things you wanted to say, could you reflect also on that aspect of where we have come in these 10 years?
Thank you very much. I think we are in a new situation, and I think the whole forum in the debates in these 2 days has been very much focused on the Ukrainian crisis, which I think we should take into account when discussing the future of the relationship between what today is the European Union and its neighborhood, and also the Western Balkans, which has become a Western Balkans. So it's getting smaller and smaller. By one country belonging to this actually joining the European Union, Croatia, for example, in 2013. And I think in these new circumstances, which are characterized, among other things, by the fact that the European Union can no longer on its own decide on its eastern borders, it needs to take into account the others. And I'm not sure about southeastern borders either, because we see competing powers or states in the Western Balkans too. So it's not just Russia and Ukraine, but we see the more direct and I think influential position of countries such as Turkey and obviously the US, which has always been here and whose policies are not always the same as the policies of the European Union. So we need to think within new circumstances. And I think these new circumstances are creating a new Europe. New Europe is a Europe that will remain unipolar within the European Union. I don't see any fundamental change there. But on the outskirts, it could be bipolar or multipolar. So we have a new situation. We have a situation in which the European Union is not the only game in town, and in which for a number of countries, if not political elite, but then certainly public opinion might get divided over this issue. And as you know, this is exactly happening. I mean, one of the things that you do as a political leader in a country that is about to join the European Union is learn how to lead. And that means not to follow exactly the public opinion. But I see a growing gap in a number of countries between those who think the European Union is still the best option and the only game in town, and it is still attractive and it is still good for economic and political and security reasons to be a member of the European Union, and those who say, well, actually it's not the same European Union as it used to be in 1990s or in the early 2000s. And I think these new circumstances should encourage us to start thinking about a new strategy. We need new strategic thinking. And I think what we need also is we need more realism. Now, what I mean by realism? I mean that in the 1990s, the process of European enlargement has been largely based on the concept of liberalism had won over all alternatives. There is no alternative to that position. And now we actually see the crisis of liberalism not only in other countries, so not in the EU, but also in some of the EU countries as well. And the new circumstances, if we have a multipolar or let's say bipolar Europe on the outskirts, will inevitably lead us to think more strategically and more realistically. What I mean by this is, I wonder whether we can continue with asking or expecting countries that are in the candidate status to primarily change values and to primarily adopt exactly the same institutions, political institutions, as those of the countries that are members of the European Union, as we expected, for example, in the 1990s. Or shouldn't we much more realistically think in terms, well, if European Union wants to be influential in the outskirts of Europe, it needs to act as a global actor, and that means it needs to expand with its influence when it can, where it can, and as soon as it can. Otherwise, this space might be left for the influence by the others. And I think if we could really neglect these others a year ago, or maybe 5 years ago, or maybe in the 1990s, then today I don't think we should do that. I think we cannot afford to completely neglect the new circumstances in the outskirts of Europe. And this leads me to be one of the advocates. I participated in this group and was in fact very much focused on this fourth argument, or the fourth scenario, which in the paper has been called Big Bang. I think the better title would be Balkan Express, if I may. I think I would be an advocate of quicker rather than slower approaching to the further enlargement of the European Union to Western Balkans. It seems to me, as we have heard, the Balkan has been a success story. Well, if it has been a success story, what's the problem then? Why not enlarge quickly? Secondly, I'm not entirely sure that long accession process makes inevitably country much more reformed and much better. There is, I think, a difference between reforming and simulating reforms. And I think we are sometimes disappointed with countries that actually join the European Union only for us then to discover, well, actually, have they really seriously reformed? Or have we just pretended that they had reformed and they pretended quite successfully that actually the reforms were very deep? And I think, in addition to that, I think we need to. I think we are talking not of a very large number of people. I mean, we were flirting with Ukraine. I mean, here we have a half of the population. And we also have countries which have been already done very much in their bilateral relations to address the negative experience of the 1990s, including the war, which was a specific question asked here. I think on the contrary, if the European Union does not actually enlarge, And I think we are now in a circumstances in which we need to consider that option too, unlike, for example, in the 1990s. If it stays the way it is, I think we'll have in the middle of the Western Balkans a wall, psychological, maybe political, a barrier which would not be of the making of Serbs and Croats and Bosniaks, it could be of the making of the European Union. And therefore some of the positive achievements and many of the positive achievements of cooperation might get endangered at some point. And I also believe that this area will not be a vacuum in terms of policy, political and other influences. There will be others who would like to expand ideologically, politically, economically, and probably also security-wise.
Dan, thank you very much. So listening to Jacques, quieter, but also quicker. So put on your slippers and not be heard as you're entering, right? Last but not least, Vedran Džihić. Vedran, obviously, neither Jacques nor Dejan had time to address the issues that I was asking about Turkey and regionalism, so maybe you can find 1 minute to respond to some of that along with the things that you want to say.
I mean, probably not to Turkey, but about regionalism. Let me just continue where Dejan stopped in a sense, and then go back to your phrase from the beginning, the glass is half full and not half empty. The question whether the glass is half full or half empty is quite obviously a question of perspective. And when we apply the perspective that Dejan has chosen here, and when we then leave this room here, particularly go to the streets and ask the citizens what is the perspective that they have, obviously the picture of the glass will be half empty, which is once again, or primarily an argument why we do need, and this is actually a consensus here, that why we do need a new kind of fresh thinking about the Western Balkans in the European Union, or Western Balkans as the part of the globalized world. And Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group has taken up this goal, and I believe this is one path to move forward. So, but let me make 3 or 4 remarks and then try to say just a few sentences about regionalism. So first of all, when we reading once again the outcomes of the Balkans Commission back in the 90s and listening the words of Ivan Krastev about Sarajevo 2014, when we stay for a moment at the picture of Sarajevo 2014, which was actually not the hour of Europe, because this picture of Sarajevo of 2014 is a picture of a political disaster of Europe, or partly because of Europe too. It is partly a picture of apathy. It is partly a picture of disenchantment with politics, with mistrust, with economic and social crisis. So when we take up this picture, then once again, a need for a new approach or much quicker approach from the European Union towards the Western Balkans is given. So, but let me make my 4 short points. We developed the parts of the members of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group 4 scenarios. The first one was business as usual. The second one, alienation from the EU, somehow the Turkey scenario. Then the abandoning EU enlargement completely because this is not attractive anymore. And then finally the Balkans Big Bang, where Dejan actually was pushing us all the time during the debates to go that particular way, to take the train, the Balkans Express, and arrive quickly in Brussels. So when we realistically look at those 4 scenarios, we are having the new commission, having the new Commissioner Hahn, we are probably going to stick with the first, business as usual. Technocratic approach, step by step, make reforms. If you do the homework, then you will 5 years plus 1 day from now on, like Goran is arguing, you will then arrive at the European Union. So, but what are the dangers of the business as usual approach? And this is actually my crucial point. So if we look at Macedonia, if we look at Bosnia, and if we look partly at Kosovo, we can actually see that the conditionality of the EU doesn't work. Full stop. The conditionality of the EU doesn't work in some cases where you do have national issues going on, where you do have territorial disputes. And if we then assume that the business as usual with the conditionality in the middle is going to be the strategy for the next few years, then I believe we are going to fail. So this is my first argument. If then conditionality is not delivering in some cases, then my point will be there is something behind conditionality, and that what is lying behind conditionality is actually the European role model. This is actually the core of Europe. And when we look at the core of Europe, there are like 3 points. First one is actually democracy, whatever we do understand under democracy. The second one is the issue of economy or social consensus. And the third one is the issue of values. And let me just in few sentences touch upon those 3 issues and then conclude with some issues on the regionalism. So, democracy. Democracy, as the first part of this role model, has mutated, not like the X-Men, but somehow mutated here in the region, at least in some parts of the region, to a huge disappointment. That means the democracy has not delivered on its promises. But still, despite that particular fact, we do need more of democracy. So, what do we have in the region? We have a democracy fatigue, not only the EU enlargement fatigue. We have democracy fatigue in Europe and globally, which is, I mean, when you look at the lack of trust, when you look at the disenchantment with politics, when you look at the disillusionment of the young generation, then you can actually arrive at the conclusion that we live partly in post-democratic times where democracy is somehow endangered. And when we apply this post-democracy phrase to the Western Balkans, then we could go on and say post-democracy in the Balkans is something that we already do have before democracy has become the only game in town. So this is actually the place or the space where we are right now. And I see here a danger of staying or remaining stuck in the gray zone or a no man's land between democracy or something that is believed to be democracy and authoritarianism. And this is the place where something that Orban has described as illiberal democracy or some alternatives like we were explaining in our report can take place and can flourish. And I'm speaking here about new authoritarianism. So this is about democracy. About economy, quickly, I mean economic cooperation and in the regional sense, topics and issues that Goran is pushing forward and that Ivan was asking about, this is definitely the way forward. And this has to be one of the homeworks that has to be done. But still at the same time, I would simply warn all of us that democracy, or actually economic cooperation is not the only cure for the problems that we do have here. So the point here, my point here, is that there is certain kind of political promiscuity in the concept of economic development or capitalism. That means instead, I mean, the usual assumption is there is a happy marriage between economy and democracy. So we cooperate and we are happy, we flourish and we prosper, we buy new cars or whatsoever, we are happy. So, but the point is that capitalism and economic, let's put it that way, neoliberal capitalism or capitalism is just as happy to bed down with authoritarianism. That is what we have in China, that is what we have in Russia. So economy, yes, but still we do need to underline some other issues in order to continue on this economic path. And if we do, by making the marriage between economy, capitalism, and some authoritarian tendencies in the rule, if we do continue on that path, we might sacrifice social justice, we might sacrifice issues of social equality on the way, and then we might end up in social protest, which is something that I see actually for Serbia obviously coming, let's say, 2015, 2016. At latest, we will have social protests on the streets of Serbia if the trend continues as it is right now. So, finally, to conclude with the third part, which is values. I mean, economy is fine, democracy is fine, but what I have been missing here during the debates is the issue of values. So back to the issues of freedom, back to the issues of rule of law, justice, equality, and so on and so on. And there is one pretty tricky point here. Nobody, starting from the Prime Minister at the first day delivering the opening speech, nobody is rejecting the core values of the European Union. This is a kind of consensus. But at the same time, the devil is in the detail. The devil is in the implementation, or in the realpolitik, like we put it in German. When we preach freedom, equality, but at the same time have a kind of pretty vague or diffuse whatsoever of declarative rhetorics that we actually cannot penetrate, and the results are more of declarative speeches and rhetorics, but the lack of real implementation or real belief in those values, then we might end up in a situation which is once again close to something that Orban is practicing in Hungary. So finally, just to sum up and to say, yes, regional cooperation not only in the economic term, regional cooperation much more in the sense of Yugospheres, which is one of the crucial points that we do have here. We have a potential of young generation of people that really do inherit and do live those values. And so to end up, I will just once again turn back to Sarajevo 2014. My picture at the beginning was pretty bleak. But at the same time, Sarajevo in 2014 was actually the birth of social protests and of popular people's assemblies, of new ghosts or new spirits of regional cooperation, of thinking in a sense together that has actually to be a kind of a way forward for all of us. And in that particular sense, BIEPAG and the work that we have been doing and the recommendations that we have here, which are going towards making a new partnership with civil societies, tackling some open issues, going back to the values, are quite important. And finally, really, just to end up by quoting Dejan Jović once again, we have to speed up. If we don't speed up in the real democratic, economic, and value terms, value-wise, then I believe some countries, not all of the Western Balkans, but some countries are ultimately going to fail. And this is quite dangerous. Thank you.
Vedran, thank you very much for those thoughts. We have come to the end of this panel. We have hard time constraints. Some people are traveling and taking planes. Others have obligations. So I hope we have fulfilled the task of this panel. We've whetted your appetite. We've given you a very complex view of how we see things here. If I take away one of the tens of things that were so subtly analyzed and presented, it is Goran's 5 years plus one. And I think that most countries have understood that it is about themselves and not about Brussels, although Brussels is a key component, the Commissar bit, as Jacques said. We have to roll up our sleeves. We have to defend the freedoms that were hard fought and gained in this country in 2000 against Milosevic's regime, the freedom of speech, of association. And I think, and we haven't had time to talk about civil society very much, but obviously that check and balance, irrespective of lots of criticism about things as they are, we do have somewhere that space of freedom. It needs to be expanded. The voice of freedom needs to be very clear. So, with the consent of our organizers, our three ladies, we will end this panel now, but I will ask you to stay on the podium. They will give a few concluding brief thoughts before we all depart, and then we are free to roam the world. But as they come up to the stage, please join me in thanking our speakers.